who is Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities and Society at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. Dr. Viola has a very interesting and diverse background in a lot of fields, I think, that will interest many of you with us today in historical linguistics, media studies, and digital humanities. She was trained in England and Italy, and is the author of a number of very interesting and impactful publications. I'll just mention one, Multilingual Digital Humanities, volume edited with Paul Spence, out in 2024, which those of you in my DH class will know quite well. We read quite a few essays in that. Without further ado, I will pass our virtual microphone over to our speaker.
Okay, wonderful. So I will first of all do, the technical. We already tried. Everything should be okay. I will just go into presentation mode. You should see my presentation now, I hope. And this thing should really go away very soon. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we do. It still has those two. Oh, the boxes are shrinking. Oh.
Yeah, I think they will go away soon. So
Okay.
let's give it a second, and if it persists, we switch as we planned. If that's okay, yes.
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. So hello everyone. It is really my pleasure and honor to be here with you today. I'm speaking from Amsterdam. It's only 12 o'clock today and it's a rainy day, so I have no idea how the weather it is in Hong Kong or wherever you're joining, but here it's pretty gray, so let's try to make this a bit more fun maybe, although the topic is quite dense. Today I will talk to you about conceptual changes in vaccine discourse, and we will try to unpack this study that I did last year. Actually, I started collecting data last year, and then the data collection ended first half of this year. So the results that I'm going to talk to you about today are up to date until the first half of 2024. And we discuss a number of topics and also methods. And I really welcome your discussion because and your questions and comments, because this is still quite recent work. So of course I welcome all your comments. So first of all, okay, 1 second. Okay, do you still see my presentation? Yeah, okay, perfect. So first of all, the most important thing to say, I think, it's the reason that really sort of spiked this study. And it's my interest in discourse in general, and the relationship between discourses and how they develop and they come into being and how they are discussed in the media, and how that in turn is reflected in society. But discourses on health specifically are a very peculiar type of discourse, because they do not come into being just spontaneously or for no particular reason. On the contrary, they really align with the political context, the social context, the economic context in which they are created, in which they develop and are perpetuated. So really, we can argue that examining how health is understood and discussed in society reflects also the way how such ideas could change over time, and how that really is a mirror onto how society understands health. Understanding this is, of course, sociologically very interesting, but it's also very important at a more, let's say, political level, because understanding how these discourses come into being and develop over time helps democracies develop effective strategies to counteract potentially harmful effects on society and on citizens. For example, a typical harmful effects on population could be mistrust in medical recommendations, mistrusting the expert role, but also using this mistrust to steer voters in influencing obviously campaigns and elections. So for all these reasons, obviously research has investigated how health is discussed and how that evolves over time. And a number of studies have been done historically on understanding and mapping and trying to really unpacking health discourse. For example, a number of studies have tried to study the public sentiment over time and how that directly influence the development and implementation of health policies. And this research really highlights this sort of dynamic process between this dynamic relationship between discourse and policy making. For example, changes, this is a very, very famous study, 2 studies that have investigated this, just as a very notorious example, changes in the narratives of the anti-tobacco movement discourse were absolutely crucial in winning regulatory battles that had been unsuccessful for decades. So these 2 studies demonstrated how the changes in the narratives of the anti-tobacco movement really had a direct impact on policy making. Other studies have looked at how the anti-vaccine activism has developed and also expanded over time. And a number of trends have been investigated and have been actually been highlighted. For example, a number of conceptual trends have really been isolated and identified in vaccine discourse. For example, there is a progressively closer alignment of anti-vaccination discourse with far-right political identity. And another feature that was identified, another characteristic, was a highly polarized discourse in which users with similar stances on vaccination interact and come into being together online, typically. Also, there have been a number of studies that have mapped and really counted, so quantified how this topic has really gained momentum over the past few years. And also, what this research has found out is that political polarization and trust dynamics significantly influence this type of discourse. So what they really, interestingly, what they found out is that regardless of whether information is true or untrue, people who endorsed, the users who endorsed the information, they did it because it was shared between, among, and also within trusted groups. So what this really means is very interesting for community detections around concepts online, and how it is important to highlight the trust element in this kind of interactions online. So a lot has been done, as it can be seen in this type of research. However, some gaps still persist. For example, discourse has been researched in general terms. For example, with no specific focus on any vaccine, for instance, just the anti-vax movement, or with the sole reference to one specific vaccine. So this, of course, I'm talking about the COVID-19 vaccine, and the most recent research about this has really focused on how this, so from the start of the pandemic to the end, how this type of discourse has changed in the span of few years. Another gap is the primary focus on English language, whereas other types of discourse in other languages and culture have very rarely been studied and analyzed. So starting for these main gaps, this research aims to investigate Italian online discourse. So I'm addressing gap 3. And also, I'm talking about a specific vaccine other than the COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm addressing gaps 1 and 2. And specifically, the type of discourse that I analyzed is the discourse about the human papillomavirus vaccine, HPV. I will talk about that briefly in a second, but first, the main gap is to identify the impact of how broader health and societal issues on non-English vaccine-related discussions come into being, and the impact that that has on how concepts about vaccine discourse really change over time. So, as I have already said, the case study is the HPV vaccine. I will just give a very, very quick and brief overview of what HPV is. So HPV is among the most commonly common sexually transmitted viruses. There are about 100 types of HPV, of which 13 have been directly linked to cancer. Among these types of cancer, cervical cancer is the most common HPV-related cancer. And incidentally, cervical cancer is also the 4th most common cancer among women worldwide. In Italy, specifically, the vaccine was commercialized in 2007 by the pharmaceutical company Merck with the commercial name Gardasil. Interestingly, Italy was the first European country to adopt a population-based vaccination strategy against the HPV virus, which already makes it quite interesting because before that, it was only really recommended for, let's say, advised and recommended for just fractions and segments of society, but Italy introduced it in the vaccination routine. Currently, the HPV vaccine in Italy is free. It's not mandatory, although there have been discussions about making it mandatory, but it is highly recommended for boys and girls between 11 and 15 years old. Recent statistics about the uptake of this vaccine have shown that there has been a steady decrease on the uptake since its first launch in 2007. And there have been studies that have also mapped some sort of correlations between the pandemic and the discussions about the pandemic and how that has directly influenced the uptake of other vaccines, such as, for example, the HPV one. So in terms of the specific vaccine and the anti-vaccination movement, this vaccine has been at the center of anti-vaccination campaigns in many countries for many, many years. There have been several studies that have identified a number of topics that are, let's say, the focus of the anti-vaccination campaigns. For example, because of this specific type of virus, which is transmitted sexually, then the anti-vaccination campaigns have let's say, advanced fears that the vaccine might give a sense of a false security to children and adolescents, and this would promote sexual promiscuity. Also, wherever discussions have been advanced about making this vaccination mandatory, there have been protest, and the main argument is that it infringes civil rights. Other topics have concerned the issue of unreported adverse effects and claiming that there have been many adverse effects that are not disclosed or officially recognized by Merck. Which directly links to problems of corruption and, of course, conspiracy theories. For example, claims of governmental and pharmaceutical exploitation and the misuse of the vaccine around the world. So these concerns have been amplified through various media. There have been documentaries, a book, and other media productions that have been very controversial. For example, the Andy Rice documentary titled Sacrificial Virgins, and this book called the HPV vaccine on trial, and several retracted articles on fertility that they linked the HPV vaccine with fertility in women. So all this obviously has created a very fertile ground for all sorts of topics being discussed and linked to the HPV vaccine online and offline, of course, but in general in the media. So for me, all this made it a very interesting use case for my research. So the methodology that I use and I will present it to you today is has the goal to map how changes in the public HPV discourse on Twitter, now X, are manifested through hashtags over time. And I'm using hashtags and not the whole post because hashtags can be interpreted as keywords. So research has shown how hashtags are not mere keywords, in fact, but they are really, they have a wider meaning in the sense that the way people construct and develop and create hashtags arguably is a direct, let's say, mirror of the concepts the user associate with that particular topic. So understanding how users use hashtags, also how users use hashtags together, so combining several hashtags, is also an interesting way to obtain insights into these concepts. And when, of course, we do that over time, that gives us really an overview of how users have gradually sort of associated different concepts, so how this has changed. So for that, I'm using bigrams. And also community detection graphs that will answer questions of discourse proliferation and awareness. So I will say a few words now about these two methods, but the point of combining these methods is to use first the concepts the users used, to discuss the topic of HPV, and also how through retweets and mutual endorsement, how users have used these hashtags to create communities together.
Hi, Lorella. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Could you try sharing your screen again? It seems to be stuck on the first slide.
What? Oh no, are you telling me now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it's terrible.
I wasn't sure when the introduction would end, but it's
okay. Let me do this again. I'm so sorry.
No, sorry.
Okay, let me do this again. Oh, I've been talking for 20 minutes now.
Yeah.
Okay. You should see the
methodology and data set. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was talking about.
Okay. Yes. There we go.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Apologies.
Okay. Oh, it makes much more sense. Okay.
Sorry. Okay, so yes, so in the end, my data set was quite small. Still, I would say meaningful conclusions could be drawn, but this should be acknowledged as a limitation of the study, that the data set does not include millions and millions and millions of tweets, but only 1,023 tweets posted between 2012 and 2024. And these, let's say, could be like a pilot study. So the results of this study could be really be the source for a larger investigation, perhaps even a multilingual one. So in order to harvest these tweets, I used specific hashtags. HPV, papillomavirus, Gardasil, Merck, and a few, but all I try to be, let's say, as neutral as possible. And this is how the dataset the tweets in the dataset distribute over time. So as you can see, there is a peak of tweets collected in 2024, and this could have been due to several reasons. I have several hypotheses for that. So one could be because of the restrictions. Once Twitter became X, several pipelines that used to be working perfectly to harvest historical tweets have problems now and actually stopped working altogether recently. So I suggest that this limitation could be due to the fact that the API blocks the retrieval of historical tweets, whereas the most, let's say, the more recent ones could be collected. So this is one hypothesis. Another hypothesis could be that, according to research, so what the literature says is that the discourse about this specific topic increase over time. So simply in previous years, there were not that many discussions about this topic. But after the pandemic, we saw a surge of discussions about and awareness, public awareness on vaccines. So there are these, let's say, one is more aligned with literature, one is more aligned with what happens in reality in life. So I don't know. I think further attempts should be made to try to collect more tweets in other languages and see whether that works. I also have to say that in Italy, on the 5th of March 2024, there was this study published by the National Statistics Institute in Italy, and they reported this study, the results of the study about HPV awareness in Italy. So maybe the fact that this study was released also spiked somehow interest in the topic. I don't know, it's hard to say. Perhaps it's a combination of all these factors, but further research should be done on this topic. But for now, let's focus on this small data set and the results that brought, bearing in mind that there are some limitations. Okay, having said that, here is how hashtags in isolation distribute in the dataset. So there is an interesting, let's say, already insight that we can, some interesting things that we can say about this. First of all, most hashtags showed little to no activity until very recent years. So 2022, 2023, and 2024. Then we can also say that several other hashtags have become, let's say, more used. Obviously, Gardasil, HPV, Merck, Pfizer, vaccine injuries, also cervical cancer. But interestingly, there is also this other hashtag that stood out and initially you would think that it doesn't have anything to do with vaccine discourse because it's Agenda 2030 in blue, as you can see in the graph. And I thought it was interesting to isolate this and to have a look at this hashtag specifically, but also what it relates to, because as you can see, all the others are more or less, they more or less have something to do with the vaccine discourse. There are others that might not, but in the interest of time, I will not go into that. I will only talk about this one at Agenda 2030. So Agenda 2030, if you're not familiar with what it is, refers to this meeting that happened in 2015 at the United Nations headquarters in New York. So heads of state and government and high representatives met on these 2 days to discuss a set of new goals to end global poverty by 2030. And this set of goals was called Agenda 2030. So Agenda 2030 has been linked to at least 3 conspiracy theories. One theory is the theory of the New World Order. So this theory is based on the idea that an elite formed by a small group of the most powerful people in the world governs the destinies of the planet for their own benefit. So for not for the benefit of the world population, but for the benefits of the elite. The second theory, the second conspiracy theory, is the Great Reboot theory, as it has been called in the media, but also in literature. It suggests that there is an orchestrated plan by the most powerful countries to appropriate all the world's health. And they also claim the pandemic was intentionally created, and it was just at the beginning of this plan. And then there is the trickle-down communism theory. This is the theory that the world left is slowly inserting ideas into Western societies so that the West would embrace communism without realizing. So these are the 3, let's say the main 3 conspiracy theories that have been linked to Agenda 2030. And I found interesting that at some point it was linked to HPV vaccine discourse. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. Let's have a look into that and why and how these 2 hashtags are actually connected. I also want to say that other interesting hashtags that have started to appear in 2023, at least, are hashtags such as vaccine genocide and then vaccini informa. This has the opposite trend. So it started to peak in 2017 and then it gradually decreased. And it is worth also saying a few words about Vaccini Informa because it's something super Italian that actually seems to no longer be active, but for a few years it was very active. So if you go to their webpage, vacciniinforma.it, that's how the webpage looks like. So you can tell that it doesn't look like super professionally made. It looks like run by a group of volunteers. And a few things that really sparkled my attention were things like at the very bottom, very tiny, they wrote Vaccini Informa non è per tutti, which means Vaccini Informa is not for everyone. Meaning, I think this is open to interpretation. But when I looked at the mission statement, I thought that it was worth, in a way, doing a bit of a discourse analysis on their mission statement. So I'm not going to read the whole statement, but there are a few interesting points that I think is worth raising. For example, they talk about the fact that they give the correct information to users. So obviously, by saying this immediately on the first sentence, this obviously is meant to give a sense of authoritativeness, obviously, to the audience. They also talk about the fact that they are indexed in top rankings search engines. There is no sources provided for this information, but that's what they claim. They also claim to provide disinterested and free information, and also to talk about a series of topics such as vaccinations, but also cancer, HIV, the virus, complaints on medical practice, and they also talk about this. They also highlight the fact that they really put a lot of effort in searching this material, in translating it, and in sharing it with their audience. They also highlight how professional their staff is, and the fact that they collaborate with foreign sources, independent journalists, associations, PhDs, and so on and so forth. That the information that they provide is serious, motivated, and objective. I have to say, I haven't really found a ton of sources given to substantiate these claims, but this is what they say in the on their webpage. And this is how the articles that they share look like. And I did not redact that. This is exactly how it looks. I think it's clippings and copy paste and links sharing from other sources. And they sort of work as a container of articles posted and shared elsewhere. So sometimes when you click on the actual article, you can also see the original source, but it's not in all the cases. And this is how it looks like. So they have a very sensational titles, sometimes in English, sometimes in Italian, and then there is the actual topic. Okay, so I put this here, and I think this will become more relevant and more clear in a minute when we look at the results. So like I said, I used the bigrams of hashtags to really see not how these topics, so these hashtags were created in isolation, but how they were really used by users together. Because I think this gives a more complete and comprehensive overview of how users constructed concepts around the topic. If you don't know what bigrams are a contiguous sequence of two n items in a text, so items that are one next to each other. So the models on which bigrams are based on are probabilistic models that predict the next item in a sequence of elements, in this case, two. So the way they predict that is that they map how probable it is that each item depends on the preceding one, and that's based on these sets of probability that can be set by the user, by the researcher. You obtain a number of items that are very likely to occur. And this is exactly what I did to map the way these bigrams were treated, bigrams of hashtags, so were treated together. So it gave me the opportunity to really map the changes in the patterns associated with the composition of these various hashtags. And when we look at the results, this is how these hashtags pairs, so the hashtag bigrams look like. So interestingly, we see spikes of vaccine genocide, vaccine murder, Others more neutral, for instance, cervical cancer and HPV, or HPV cervical cancer. Others are vaccine adverse effects, vaccine turbo cancers, vaccine murder, Agenda 2030, Agenda 2030, Mislav Kusic, sorry if I am mispronouncing the name. And as you can see, what's interesting here, I think, is that they were more or less all silent until 2022, and then there is like a spike in the use of anti-vaccination discourse. And again, some of it is definitely due to the limitations of the dataset itself. However, I think that still it's interesting how within the dataset, more neutral hashtags, bigrams are still not spiking that much. For instance, Gardasil HPV in light blue reaches more or less the halfway ranking, whereas vaccine genocide and vaccine murder are really at the top. So I isolated the bigrams that are more anti-vaccine, and these appear to be the ones that I already told you about: vaccine genocide, vaccine deaths, vaccine murder, and vaccine turbo cancer, or cervical cancer vaccine injuries. So how the cervical cancer is also linked to injuries caused directly by the vaccine, and I thought this was also interesting. And also frequency of potentially pro-vaccination bigrams. I say potentially because I didn't look at the wider context of the posts. I'm just assuming that because these bigrams do not contain vaccine turbo cancers or vaccine deaths, probably they belonged to tweets that were more proactive. They were just trying to raise awareness on the vaccine itself. So, and I thought it was interesting to have a look at how these were, apart from cervical cancer HPV, which scores still fairly high compared to the others. It's still interesting to see how generally they score lower compared to anti-vax hashtags. And this, of course, still aligns with the literature that says that the anti-vaccination communities, although they are smaller in size, they are more vocal. So it would make more sense that they just tweet more compared to more, let's say, pro-vaccine communities. Okay, so this was the first part of the study where I already had an interesting overview of how the concepts associated with vaccine discourse seem to have shifted from, let's say, a more quiet discourse first, but also perhaps a more neutral one, towards a more aggressive discourse against a more vocal one in terms of numbers of tweets, but also in terms of content. So after that, I wanted to know more about how the communities looked like, right? So the people that actually tweeted and used these hashtags, how these communities evolved. Can we have a look at how the use of hashtags really is insightful of community development online? And I used the Girvan-Newman algorithm, which is a useful algorithm to map networks that supposedly are not huge. And this was, of course, the case because the data set is not very big, as we have seen. So I thought that this specific algorithm that tries to identify communities in smaller data sets could be just right for the purpose of my study. So each node that we see in the next visualizations corresponds to a hashtag, and an edge between two nodes corresponds to their co-occurrence in a given time stamped, aggregated by year. So what I did, I tried to map how many times hashtags were tweeted together in a given timestamp, and then I aggregated that by year. So what we see here is hashtags that were tweeted together at least 5 times, so to get rid of, let's say, noise in the data set as much as possible. So whatever we see here has been tweeted together at least 5 times in a given timestamp. And then I divided my networks, community detections, in spans of 4 years. 3-4 years for see what happened to these communities. So here we look at the community of hashtags from 2012 to 2015. And here we see 3 communities, 3 distinct communities. So there is the yellow community, the red community, and the green community. We see these communities are fairly small, but this is due, of course, to the fact that the data set in this time span is not particularly big to start with. And we can have a look at the specific hashtags used by each community. For example, the yellow community uses Vaccini Informa, which is the platform that I told you about a few slides back, which is kind of a, I don't know, was it disinformation? I really don't know, but certainly let's say the articles that were posted had quite sensationalist titles. So, okay, so this was very vocal because it is at the center of the community. And then, interestingly, it is connected to these 2 other hashtags, which is Codacons and CDC. CDC is the abbreviation of Codacons. So Codacons is the National Associations for Consumers in Italy. And it is meant to, let's say, harvest and provide advice to users and consumers who complain about something, typically against the corporate world. So it is interesting how Vaccini Informa is connected to that. So I would say at this point, if I had to make a sort of general conclusion about the topics discussed in this community, I would say that there are links to authoritative sources such as the Codacons and, of course, CDC, and also the general topic of vaccino. So that was discussed. Then we have the red community, and the red community looks to be more, let's say, about discussions about the HPV vaccine in general and the virus itself. So I would say it could be perhaps a community that talks about the broader topic of human papillomavirus and possibly issues related to it. So at this point, of course, it's not, of course, without looking at the specific tweets, there is no way to say that. For certain. And then we have the green community, which is sort of very specialized, that only talks about Gardasil. So there is just one community that talks about that specific vaccine. So not in general, but really just Gardasil, which is the name of the vaccine, the commercial name of the vaccine. Okay, so moving on, let's see how the community changed. Then we have, okay, I think this is the wrong image. I'm so sorry because it's the same, but I can tell you what happens here. So I don't think I can, I will share it in the question and answer, but I can comment on the next community, which is the one from 2016 to 2020. So what happens here is that we have actually a change in the 2 communities, and it's a shame that you cannot see that, but I will tell you in a minute. So what happens here is that basically it's like the red community swaps with the switches topics with the yellow community, and it's interesting to see because we have vaccine informa and codagons and HPV that become more, let's say, vocal, so the community becomes bigger, and also there are other topics that appear. For example, let's say Gardasil, which was previously only in the green community, becomes incorporated in the same community as Vaccine Informa, and also it grows in numbers. So the community, the yellow community, and the before it had more nodes. But over time, it is the red community that becomes bigger, and it sort of incorporates hashtags that previously belonged to the other two communities. And we will see that in the question and answer. I will share the other image. Apologies for this. But then we reach the end of our dataset timestamp, which is the community of hashtags between 2020 and 2024. And here we see an impressive change, right? So the green community completely disappeared. We have no green community, but I don't know if you can see this, but if you can see where my mouse is going. So Gardasil was completely incorporated inside the red community. And also we can see how much more vocal it has become and how it incorporates several other hashtags, for example, AstraZeneca, for example, COVID, for example, vaccine genocide, vaccine adverse events, non sono vaccini, COVID-19, corruption, and others. We have oncology, we have budget 2024, agenda 2030 here, medical malpractice here, and so on. So we can see how the red community now, it has started to incorporate also topics that include the vaccine, but also all the controversies and issues raised by the anti-vax community that we discussed at the beginning. And we also see other topics that were also highly influential at the time, right? Between 2020 and 2024. Of course, other vaccines, for instance, AstraZeneca, but also COVID-19 and the wider pandemic, Agenda 2030. So as we can see, there are other social narratives that are represented within this, within the red community. And I found this extremely interesting because the yellow community is also connected, closely and tightly with the red community through hashtags such as Mislav Kolakusic, that if you, I don't know if you remember this political figure, but he was very, very vocal during the COVID-19, and especially he was very vocal against the European strategy of approving and commercializing the vaccine in Europe, and he denounced cases of corruption, and he said that Pfizer and the COVID-19 vaccine was the biggest scandal of all times. So as you can see, this, although it's not directly connected with the HPV vaccine specifically, it's still very densely connected to discussions about it. So I think this has direct really repercussions, but also insights and points that we should take, and particularly health communication organizations and governments should really understand how nowadays topics in isolation do not really work. So now the community online, it has become more connected, and public health communication strategies need to be highly adaptive, and they really have to take into account a wide range of interconnected concerns, not just specific issues exclusively, as we see the fact that, as we have seen, the fact that, for example, the community that was highly specialized, the green community, completely disappeared and was in fact incorporated in the other community, the red one. Talking about the wider summary of the results that this pilot study brought, there is a general increase on this type of discourse. Again, we have to take into account the limitation of the data set, but it aligns with the wider literature. There seems to be more awareness about health discourse and specifically vaccine safety and side effects. Compared to previous years, it appears that the discourse has shifted from awareness about vaccine towards concerns about vaccine safety. The emergence of hashtags that were not present in previous years, such as Agenda 2030, may suggest a blending of health discussions with wider topics that happen in society, about events that happen in society, for instance, political activism, social issues, and potentially also conspiracy theories. Another point, a good point that we can draw from this study is that the rapid increase in the frequency of biograms such as vaccine genocide and vaccine murder may really signal the role of social media in amplifying discussions. And how that, of course, also amplifies discussions offline. And again, the disappearing communities is also something that public health communication strategies should take into account, and the fact that discussions become more integrated over time, more complex, more diverse, and highly specialized topics seem to disappear. And one last word about the importance of mapping conceptual changes in general, but also specifically for health discourse. It really helps understanding how the shifts in concepts also in a way is connected to how obviously discussions come more integrated over time. And of course, the public discourse, we know that, don't we, that evolves in response to broader public concerns and societal issues. So it only makes sense that this would happen. But it really needs to be taken into account as a takeaway by public health communication, how health discourse is perhaps one of the most heavily dependent discourse on societal concerns. So perhaps rather than targeting specific issues exclusively, strategies should really address a wide range of interconnected concerns. So that concludes my presentation. I think I'm even slightly earlier than the time that was allocated to me. Thank you so much. I would now welcome the questions, if there are any, and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very interesting and wide-ranging presentation. I see we already have questions in the chat.
Wonderful. I would just take 1 second, if possible, I want to pull that image that, unfortunately, I'm so sorry, somehow was not incorporated in the presentation, so that if there are questions about that, I will have it ready, if that's okay. It will just take me a second, really. Yeah, it will just take me a second. Yeah, but if you, I don't know if you would like to.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask a sort of general question while people are typing. So, I mean, there are lots of ways to get at this, to sort of attack this sort of sort of problem. But I was wondering, I mean, do you see any patterns to the way that certain beliefs or concepts stick together or somehow
Mm,
become related? I think we all have a sense that there's kind of
mhm.
sort of political ideologies around which somewhat unrelated ideas tend to cluster. But I'm wondering if you have any insights on this.
Yeah, thank you. So what I saw is that when it comes to health specifically, obviously everybody, concerns everyone. And I would say that on the one hand, I saw a pattern because of course I looked into the data set. Of course, I didn't really show the actual sources of the tweets of the users, but I saw the following pattern. So the users that tend to share tweets that are to raise awareness, to talk about specific health issues neutrally, let's say, or to just share information, scientific information, tend to be from official sources.
Mm.
Whereas there is so this would be like a top down. So topics together there would be really just about the importance of vaccination, the importance of the risks associated to HPV in this case, for example. Whereas then there is a top down also sort of community of tweets that is really the users of this vaccine, if you will. So the population, the people, the citizens, and they are trying to talk about their worries. They're trying to talk about what they are scared. And there seems to be at some point a communication channel breakdown happening there. So it's like I talk A and you respond B, and there is no way these things stick together. In between, whoever gives the more convincing explanation wins. And the tweets and the users that give the more convincing explanation are the ones that talk about the risks, and you basically respond to an anxiety. And obviously these people tweet because they are genuinely scared, most of them. Others will have other motivations, I'm sure. But what I saw, the general pattern that I saw is this one.
Mm. Okay, so it's that kind of negativity bias, I guess, that humans
I
have.
would say, but it's also, I think, the fact that generally people don't feel like they are listened to.
Mm.
So if I had to make like a recommendation for public health communication strategies, I would say
Mm.
be more honest about the risks associated not just to the disease but also to the vaccine,
Mm.
because people feel like we are told all the risks associated to the actual disease, which of course are so legitimate and true, but you
Mm.
never talk, you minimize the risks associated to the vaccine, which of course, like every kind of drug in the world will have. That's of course a fact. Whereas if you look at this type of communication, it's all about, oh, there are side effects with any drug. So people feel like, tell me the whole story, and then I will decide for myself. Whereas of course I think the public communication strategies generally is, if we tell the whole stories, nobody will take the vaccine.
Mm.
And by doing that, they reinforce and they in fact fuel communities that answer to that kind of worry, the genuine concern about, tell me whether I still want to do it, but tell me if I'm risking also something else.
Mm.
So this is the kind of the kind of pattern that I saw. So it's not all, let's say, oh, it's just, nut cases that they talk about it. It's not all of them.
Mm. Yeah, and it's interesting the way vaccines, I guess, are similar or different to other sorts of drugs that you don't take in a sort of prophylactic way. Like
Mm-hmm.
I think because you're not suffering from the disease yet, people
That's
maybe ask
right.
more questions. Whereas if you actually do have the disease, people say, well, side effects, whatever, you know.
People are more willing to sort of put up with the side effects because they have the disease already. I know what you mean. Yeah. So we really need to do more work on how we tailor these communication strategies to reach out to people that are generally worried about this.
And in general, people are, humans are not good at statistical thinking.
No, our brains do not really work like that. It's true. It's very true. Yeah.
Great. So we have a lot of questions.
Let me open the chat. Are they all in the chat? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, they should all be visible to you.
Okay, let me see. Okay, I will start with this one. Okay. Compared to previous vaccination campaigns, is the utilization of hashtags better in terms of crisis response? Are you asking about the HPV or what is in the literature in general? So if you could elaborate a bit more on this question. I don't know if the audience can actually talk.
We normally do everything through the chat.
They can unmute themselves.
Okay.
Yeah. Here we go.
In general. She elaborated. Yes. In general. Okay. So, better in terms of crisis response. I don't know what is better. How do you measure quality in this case? How do you measure the impact of hashtags? I don't think there is a terrific amount of research on measuring the sort of impact of crisis response hashtags. That could be an interesting, perhaps, thing to look at. But in order to define better, you would have to somehow assess how users receive the messages and how they respond to those messages. So that's how you could do it. But I am not aware of any research actually on this because it's very hard to do also. Okay. Then okay, yeah, thank you. So I think I covered your question about what advice would you give to governments for future pandemics regarding the use of hashtags for vaccines. So to sum up, what the results seem to show at this point, with all the limitations that this study has, is that highly specific and let's say targeted hashtags do not seem to be effective, or do not seem to be as effective as hashtags that also include, let's say, they have a more holistic overview of the topic. So they, let's say, include other sorts of hashtags that might not seem directly related. So my advice would be to be more in touch with what happens in society at large and to cater for what users really want to know about if they want to be effective. This seems to be in line with what the results show. Okay, then I will move on. And please let me know if I don't answer your question, of course, and I will be happy to elaborate more. I wanted to ask, how does the anti-vaccine campaign influence the vaccination, and how to balance the civil rights and public health vaccination, like COVID-19 vaccine? Well, that's a very good question. I would say it is not really the focus of this study in particular, but I can tell you what the literature says about anti-vaccine campaign. There have been quite a few studies about Japan and how anti-vaccination campaigns seem to have radically and really drastically influence the uptake of HPV vaccine specifically. There have been several studies that have tried to find direct significant correlations between these anti-vaccination campaigns and uptake, and at some point, I think the numbers dropped significantly. And in Japan, if I remember correctly, originally the vaccine was maybe mandated, and then in the end, the government just gave up, I think, and it is not compulsory anymore. So the impact was quite strong. There are a few studies about this. If you just, I think, on Google Scholar put HPV Japan vaccination strategies, you will find a lot of references on that. And about the balance with civil rights and public health, this really is a long-standing debate, also in health legal studies. I have quite a few colleagues that work on this, on a policy for health recommendations. Of course, this immediately enters the law field, and obviously the balance is always tricky there. And it is really beyond my competence here, my expertise in law, and what infringes which laws in which country. It's difficult to say, but I can tell you that in Italy there are several vaccines that are compulsory for children, and they are part of the vaccination routine. And if you do not take these vaccines, I think by the age, by school age, so by 6 years old of age, you're not admitted in school. So Italy is often taken as a case study in law to talk about where is the limit here, where we draw a line. And yeah, maybe you can also look into that. It would be interesting to see what you find. Vaccini Informa, okay, to provide free, unbiased, and detailed medical information across various fields impacted public health awareness and decision-making since its inception in 2015. Yeah, it's also interesting there. And now Vaccini Informa is no longer active, at least not on the platform. I'm not sure whether they simply changed name or they are more vocal on other platforms, because they also mention on their website YouTube and other platforms, Instagram even, I think. So it would be interesting to see whether they sort of left maybe X, Twitter, and now they use other platforms and measure whether they're still vocal and active there. This is something that could be done on a more focused study on the platform. And in terms of whether this impacted health awareness and decision making, this would also be an interesting spin-off from this study, I think. To see whether could we measure any impact that they actually had, whether this was taken up consciously. Unfortunately, at this point, I do not have enough data on that. Again, this data set is way too small to draw any significant conclusions on this, but certainly as a spin-off would be a great study to really measure whether you could see any correlations, at least significant correlations on that. So thank you for your question. What insights can be gained from using social media to understand the conceptual changes in the discourse surrounding the HPV vaccine? Well, one certainly good insight that we can draw from this study is that really social media remain possibly the most prolific locus for conversations to happen. and things can go viral pretty quickly on social media, way more than on traditional media. So this is still the case, and because more and more social media seem to pop up all the time, I suspect it's really where I don't know, the conversation seems to happen. And of course, we can talk about how representative each one of these platforms really is of the wider society. Of course, there are chunks of society who are not represented on these platforms, absolutely. But still, we're talking about millions and millions / billions of people, depending on the platform that you use. For instance, TikTok, it's now huge, and also, the counterparts in other countries, it's, I think, for what specifically the HPV vaccine in Italy is concerned, and the focus of the study, I would say that I will have to probably compare the same time span with traditional media, and see what kind of conversations are in traditional media, for example, newspapers and magazines, and perhaps draw a comparison there to be able to answer your question. But I would say certainly they're so quick and instant that it's conversations pick up like this on social media. So I would say the impact is still high. What role do you see for interdisciplinary collaboration in addressing the challenges of vaccine misinformation, and how can different fields contribute to a more informed public? That's a great question. We definitely need to talk more together with health communication specialists, of course, social scientists, and all the fields that can get together. The more the merrier, I would say. I am a big promoter of interdisciplinary collaboration, and as you can see, I borrow methods from other fields. I mix linguistics analysis, media studies, computer science methods, social science statistics. So what I could say is that really definitely only with a synergetic collaboration we can craft more efficient health communication strategies, and obviously combat and counteract misinformation, I would say. So isolated and fragmented approach do not seem to have been able to be working well. So we need to be more integrated for sure. What role do you see for social media platforms themselves in managing the spread of health misinformation? Is the misinformation a trend or pattern? And was this reflected in the amounts of hostages or tweets? I don't know what you mean about hostages, but in terms of managing the spread of health misinformation, so this is very tricky to do because some things are very hard to classify as misinformation. And what is false today may turn out to be true tomorrow. And we saw this also during the pandemic, right? We saw this during the health crisis, that things that sounded absolutely preposterous at the beginning, 1 year after, actually turned out to be absolutely true. So sometimes it's very clear cut, and it's really easy to flag things as misinformation or disinformation or really plain fake news. But other times it's very difficult, and considering the speed and amount of social media posts that is produced every day, we are of course talking about billions and billions and billions. You cannot do the fine-grained analysis, human-made and driven, that would be necessary to be able to detangle post by post. So this is, of course, done already automatically and with some sort of algorithms. But of course, it fails, obviously, and sometimes true information gets flagged and false misinformation does not. So again, in this case, social media platforms should also really more come together and tweak their business model a little bit, because of course the reason why they don't employ humans to do that is because humans are more expensive, of course, than machines. So one responsibility would be also, governments should really really mandate social media managers, social media platforms to regulate this somehow. And it's not an easy task. Again, it might infringe also freedom of speech, obviously issues. So there is responsibility, sure. But how to assign that kind of responsibility and how to manage the flux of information that is produced every day, that's quite a complex issue. But for sure there is responsibility. Whether misinformation is a trend, I actually did not look at the post themselves. So I cannot answer your question, the second part of your question, because of this. Because I should do close reading analysis of all the tweets to be able to say how many of these were plain misinformation and others were just concerns or people just talking about their experience. Without looking at the context, I cannot answer your question. Okay, there are last two questions, and I think we are perfectly on time, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, could you elaborate on the specific factors that contributed to the shift from virus awareness and vaccine advocacy to a predominancy of anti-vaccination narratives? I obviously cannot claim this 100% sure, because there are always push and pull factors in everything. However, the results seem to clearly point to the fact that there is definitely an interconnectedness of issues with the pandemic and everything that was related to all the things that were happening at the time. Which, of course, I would be surprised if this was not the case, obviously, because clearly whatever happens in society is reflected in any kind of health discourse. So even though I didn't specifically harvest hashtags that ended up in my dataset anyhow, it's a proof of how really these issues were deeply interconnected and how awareness and anxiety about one topic directly correlates with other topics, awareness and latent maybe anxiety about other topics. So concerns about the COVID-19 and corruption claims and conspiracy theories at the time directly also pulled the HPV vaccine discussions in. So definitely external events become very internal when it comes to health discourse. Okay, this is our last question, I think. How can the government improve? Yeah, somebody has already asked this. Specifically during COVID-19, well, those years were just a crazy time, right? So everything and the opposite of everything was said all the time. And there was also the issue that each country was just taking opposite measures compared to other countries. So nobody really knew what we should be doing. And this created, which is typical in any crisis, right? It was not specific to the COVID-19 health crisis. In any crisis, whoever is in charge has to act quickly. So you have to say something, and probably what you say now will be completely discredited tomorrow, but today I need to tell you something. And this is exactly what happened. So all the heads of states and public health figures had to say what was true on that specific moment in time, which unfortunately turned out to be false maybe the day after. And because the situation was so dynamic, this created just more confusion. And I think something that could have been done maybe better was just trying to reassure the population that actually it was a crisis, and a lot was still unknown about the situation, and everyone was trying to work incessantly to try to solve the crisis. But a lot of things still needed to be, a lot of questions still needed to be answered. Whereas what they tended to do was to just to look very assertive every time they were just talking to the public, although they had no idea what was happening actually, and they knew that what they were saying, probably they had to retract the following day. And this created, I think, a sense of mistrust in the public, because everybody looked so assertive, but actually none of them was sincere, or very few of them were, or they were sincere at the best of their capacity at the time, but they should have just said that. And if they had, perhaps the public response would have been less skeptical, and maybe less fertile ground for conspiracy theories would have been created, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, maybe in our final, we have about 8 minutes, I think. Maybe we can return to something I mentioned at the beginning, which is this sort of multilingual question you've been sort of working on. So this analysis is kind of transnational and multilingual.
Yeah, it is.
I wonder if you kind of talk about some of the challenges to that and how you try to overcome them.
Yeah, it was really a challenging data set to work with, because the topic is really obviously social media transcend borders, don't they? And so do the conversations. So even though you target a specific language in the data set, such as Italian, and I tried to harvest tweets only in Italian, of course, anything happened, ended up in the data set, because some hashtags could have been used either, right? Papillomavirus is also the, in Italian and in English, for example, but also HPV and Merck, these are, or Agenda 2030. If I read it, 2030 is in English, but of course it's spelled exactly the same also in Italian. So really, in the end, a lot of so the data set needed to be sort of also filtered for just Italian to be able to do this analysis. But it's true that one of the main challenges was really to sort of sort out the language of the posts and of the hashtags, really. And even so, still a few hashtags in English ended up in the count anyhow, because of what I said, because it was impossible to detangle, and also some Italian tweets also used international hashtags. And if on the one hand this was quite challenging, and you can at some point, to a certain extent, you can automate that, but still, I think it requires a lot of human intervention. So if on the one hand, this is time consuming. On the other hand, this, if anything, shows how interconnected and global conversations are today in social media. And this is, in fact, maybe one strength of this data set rather than a weakness, the fact that when looked at it in its entirety, I would be able to look at the topic discussed in other languages also, although this was not my initial intention. So there will be another study about how conversations about this topic were discussed in several countries and in several languages, and how that can be linked directly to cultural assumptions, specifically of the specific countries, so stereotypes about gender, for example, and about masculinity and femininity and sexual promiscuity, and how that could be perhaps how that was in fact different depending on the language in which the tweet was treated. So the weakness in the end turned out to be a strength of the data set.
And in addition to sort of language information, do you also have location for any of these tweets, or?
I do not, but it was told to me that when you set the language to one specific language, actually it harvests the location, but not exactly the language. So it basically harvests the location of the user, so the country in which the user was at the moment of the tweet, but not necessarily the language in which. So although I set the language Italian, in fact, what that did was to just harvest the location. That somebody that works with Twitter told me that. I need to double check that because I'm not entirely sure whether that is true. But one thing is true, that I ended up having a multilingual data set. So I don't know. I need to double check that, but it would be interesting also to map locally, to see where discussions took place.
Yes, and maybe slightly less for Italian, but certainly for, say, like Spanish, which is the national language of sort of over a dozen countries, and English, which is the international language. I can imagine that gets or French. It would get rather complicated. So
it would be complicated, but not impossible, I think, and it would still be very interesting to do. But like with everything, is of course the time, labor, money, and all that. But of course, I think from this, even just starting from this small data set, already working on it, I could think of at least 3 or 4 other research pilots that could have been done and could be done, and others that were also suggested here. Definitely, it's a very fertile ground to research. That's for sure.
Yeah, and maybe our sort of final question, as this is the Digital Humanities Initiative seminar. I'm wondering if you could sort of talk maybe a little bit on the first bit of digital humanities, on the kind of sort of, you mentioned, the Gervin-Newman method, but you maybe sort of talk a little bit more about sort of how you approach this from a kind of technical perspective, and what advice you might have for other people approaching problems like this.
So obviously the algorithm that you use to map the communities obviously influences the way these communities will be identified clearly. So one thing that I did was to look at several community algorithms. And the reason why I chose this one, like I said, was because really this methodological choice was done because, of course, the dataset was so small, and the Gervin-Newman algorithm was specifically developed for small networks and to find the hierarchy. So the most prominent, let's say, nodes within a small data set, which other algorithms might have not fully captured. Of course, however, this comes with its own set of limitations. The whole, let's say, the full account of the semantic relationships between the tweets in a way might have been, let's say, not lost, but not fully captured by the algorithm. And this is why I paired the Hirvan-Newman algorithm method with bigrams, because bigrams give you the semantic associations. So how likely are these two terms to be used together? And so I use this as the basis for the Hirvan-Newman algorithm. So this was a methodological, obviously, a choice. I think if I had used just the Hirvan-Newman algorithm, I would have had different results, and perhaps the semantic relations would have not so, let's say, comprehensively captured if I had not used bigrams also. Other algorithms the users might want to explore maybe is the InfoMap algorithm and the spectral clustering. These are other community detection algorithms that could also be integrated also perhaps, or at least compared, and to see whether you get similar results. And another thing that I would like to do is to look at the posts themselves and perhaps to do topic modeling also to see whether the communities directly relate to the topics that are discussed within the communities, whether that can be also seen and really mapped together and tracked. But methodologically, yeah, I chose this because really due to the size of the data set and because I really wanted to know not all the communities, but only the most prominent ones.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. So we've reached, it's 7:30 p.m. here in Hong Kong. So I think we should
time for
wrap
dinner.
up. Yes, well, exactly.
And time for lunch for me.
Yes, exactly. But for those of you who are still with us, just to remind you, we'll be back next week with Luke Blaxill, who's going to be talking about text mining. And then I guess all that remains for me to do is to thank our speaker for her tremendous presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day. Bye. 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 Bye.